methodology is the traditional methodology called grammar translation, which in Australia was dominant up to the late 1960s. It consisted of grammar points and readings. The teacher talked a lot, the students were quiet, and students answered one by one. It was very good for reading, and it was very good for translation, but that method has passed. The trouble is a lot of teachers haven't let it go. One of the problems with teachers of English is that they don't like change. And when a new method comes in, they tend to resist it or try and stay with the old method. What I recommend is a teacher who can take the best of each methodology and use it in their own teaching. But some teachers are very resistant to change. Grammar translation was good in its day. I learned French and Latin by grammar translation. And I became quite good at reading, but I couldn't speak and I couldn't listen. And what happened was the advent of wide-bodied planes and mass tourism from the late 1960s. People wanted to travel. They wanted to speak and they wanted to listen. And so grammar translation was finished. The next major methodology, Professor Jay mentioned it, was audiolingual, which in Australia was dominant from the late 1960s to the late 1980s. This was the language lab. All language teachers had a language lab in those days. If you didn't have a language lab, you were finished. Do you remember the language labs? That's how we all learned language back 40 and 30 years ago. And there were some very good points about this method. One of the best points is one of the best aspects of this method, it didn't start from grammar and rules. It started from patterns, authentic patterns being spoken. The modelling that Professor Jay talked about. And then students repeated and repeated and repeated until they got the whole pattern right. Later it was criticised, talking to a machine. Why would you talk to a machine? That doesn't prepare you for life. But it was better than grammar translation. The patterns, the authentic sentence patterns were very important. Because one of the things, when I listen to Indonesians learning Indonesian, what they tend to do is substitution. They have an Indonesian sentence, and then they put in Indonesian words. So the sentence is still Indonesian, but with English words. My students in Australia learning Indonesian are the same. They use an English sentence, and they substitute Indonesian words. One of the great problems of language teaching is the students wanting to use substitution. The good thing about audiolingual was that it started with full, authentic patterns, spoken aloud, modelled, we can still do that, modelling, and repetition. Who is that? That's me learning Indonesian 47 years ago. 47 years ago in the language lab. I learned Indonesian from Bu Kathy. Aku dulu cakap loh. Dulu. Sekarang merosot total, but that's okay. That's how we learned language in the late 1960s, 70s and 80s. And it was good. I can speak Indonesian. You can hear that. I was lucky to have audiolingual combined with native speakers and then in-country experience. So, in the second, we had grammar translation, audiolingual. Students memorized and manipulated. The good thing, less teacher talk, more student activities. The good thing, students talked. The bad thing was they talked in the language lab. They talked to a machine and not to human beings. But it was better for speaking and learning. The next methodology that came in mostly in the 1980s, methodology comes in first in English, ELT, because that's where the money is. It's big money, it's big business. That's why there's change. A big change creates big money. Language teaching change starts in English, then moves to foreign European languages, then it moves to Indonesian, and then it finally moves to the truly difficult languages of Japanese and Chinese, where often the change collapses, and it's time for a new change. Functional notional, very interesting methodology. Professor Jay also mentioned it. It was a new view of materials from grammar and situations to what were called functions, and the functions in English all end in ing. Greetings, leave takings, asking, requesting, explaining. It was a changed organisation of content rather than class practice. Just for example of some functions, here's a lesson from a lesson on shopping. And here are there's no mention of grammar here, but here are the functions: asking about price, identifying objects, expressing surprise and shock, bargaining broken down into offering a price, refusing a price, agreeing on a price, describing quality, comparing, indicating, and then there's personal language by chores. So functional notional was a very valuable way of reorienting the stock of things we wanted to do in language. Grammar translation started from grammar and reading. Audiolingual started from patterns, speaking and listening. Functional notional changed the material, so instead of starting from patterns or starting from grammar, we started from functions. So I think every teacher now to this day should keep in mind not only what they want to teach, but the functions, what students want to do with it. You saw in Professor Jay's videos the students, without quite articulating, using a different number of functions of expressing and describing. It's quite clearly there. Then in the 1980s in Australia, particularly, the fourth methodology that came in was communicative teaching, which has lasted really until today, I think. You use communicative teaching? In communicative teaching, the emphasis moved to pairs and groups, tasks, jobs to do together. When you were learning, you couldn't learn by yourself. You must communicate with others. There was less teacher talk and more student talk. The teacher introduces, models and reviews. The teacher walks around the classroom where the students are teaching. Communicative methodology involves a lot of student talk, and it's loud. The English language classroom should be loud and it should be noisy. Other teachers may not like it. It should be loud and it should be noisy. I think the communicative language teaching gave us a lot of good techniques. Oops, the grid. You know what you mean by the grid? Do you people use a lot of grids? Yes, I'll move down. I'll be like Professor J, but I won't work up and down so much. He's still fit, but I'm still fat. He's involved in fitness. I'm involved in fatness. Thank you very much. So I can't run around nearly so much. But look at these grids. The thing I like about a grid like this is that it's easy. It's so easy. Communicative. The difference about teaching beforehand was there was a lot of language on the page and not much language in the air. The difference with communicative teaching is there is very little language on the page, but a lot of language being elicited in the air. And this grid, I hope you use grids because they're so easy to do. This is my favorite technique for teaching a class of 28 or 30. You put the name, the teacher writes the themes in here that are going to be discussed. For example, here's one for beginners. It's about pets. So there's still no language here. I'm sorry my drawing is so terrible, but I put in, that's a dog. You mightn't believe it, but it's a dog. That's a cat, that's a bird, that's, what's that? A mouse. Or that's a rabbit, okay? So you still see there's very little language on the page. But the students go around and interview each other about whether they like these animals or not as pets. So each time they interview another student, they put the student's name here, and then they record the answers briefly there. Do you like dogs? Why? Why not? Do you like cats? Why? Why not? Do you like some sort of bird? Yes or no? Do you like mice? Yes or no? And you see, this sort of activity is very similar to audiolingual. A pattern is introduced by the teacher. The pattern is modelled. Professor Jay said the emphasis of the teacher being the source of the language and modelling the structure. But then it is repeated and repeated and repeated. By the time they've done this, interviewed 4 other students and got 5 responses, they've used the pattern 20 times and got 20 responses. So it's like what was happening in the language lab, that it's taken out into the class. And you can use your creativity. I absolutely agree with the professor. The best examples draw on student creativity. Does that seem okay? Yeah. Have your grid. Don't do all your teaching by grids. You've got to be, a creative teacher changes all the time. This is about animals, but I can do it up to all sorts of levels. For a higher level, it can be about what English reading do you like? Poetry, novels, short stories, comics or vlogs. I can lift the level by it can be about politics. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Jokowi, Vladimir Putin, Ahok. I'm sorry to put Ahok next to Vladimir Putin. I don't mean anything by that, of course. I'm sorry to put Hillary Clinton up the top. I wanted her to win. Sorry. Donald Trump, oh my God. Save us all. You can put in philosophy. A grid doesn't have to be about simple topics. It's a simple task, but it can have complex topics and complex language. It could be about philosophy. Hegel, Supomo, Aristotle, Plato, Bernard Russell. The task is simple, but the concepts and the language can be simple. Here's another one I like, a simple quiz. This is also for beginners. What do you usually eat? What do you usually eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner? What do you usually eat for breakfast? What do you usually eat for lunch? What do you usually eat for dinner? If someone interviews 4 other students, they've used the same core pattern 12 times, but in a real life situation about their lives, just as he was saying. You can put it on the back as well, so that it allows for the good student to do a lot of interviews and the weaker student to do only a few. It allows for different students to go at their own pace. And while they're doing this, the teacher is not standing up, sitting at the front. Don't sit out the front. The teacher is moving around the class, listening. Are there problems? If there's a general problem in the grammar or the structure, stop the class, model again. If there are small errors, let it go. You can correct them later. The important thing is the interaction students are doing about their own lives. Look at this. Not much language on the page. A lot of language in the air. Here's another one. A quiz. What are the characteristics of a good teacher? What are the characteristics of a good student? Students like to talk about teaching when they're in the classroom. They have ideas about teachers. They have ideas about students. But look what I'm saying. Very little language on the page. There are only a few words. What are the characteristics of a good teacher? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What are the characteristics of a good student? Only one more. There are only 8 words on that page. But it elicits a lot of words from the students. You can be teaching grammar through this. You can say, I want adjectives. You can say, I want verbs. You can add adverbs to the verbs. You can have nouns. You can have concepts. You can tell the students what grammar, you don't have to, you can tell the students what grammar. There are grids, quizzes, ranking. I put all of these in the paper, so will they get a copy of the paper? I've put these in the paper that I sent so that you don't have to do anything but print them if you want to use them, and to use your own. Another very common exercise in communicative is ranking. This one, the aspects of teaching being important. Students say, which is most important? Why? Here you're putting in language and eliciting language for them as well. Remember, with communicative teaching, it taught us to say activities that are used by pairs or small groups. The task cannot be completed without interaction. Very little language on the page, a lot of language in the air. It's so easy for you to make these sort of activities. Just put pictures down, oops, sorry, it's upside down. Put pictures down the side, or words. Photocopy, that's what you have to do. Photocopy, get ready. Put it on the back as well, so that the good students can do more, the slower students do less. It caters for good and weak students in the same class. Put the good together with the weak, or put the good and the weak together. You can use different tasks. Is that okay? Yes. Yes. And I've sent it in. There's the little quiz. What do you usually eat? There's the quiz. Little language on the page. A lot of language in the air. Here's a ranking exercise for a much higher group of, if I had time I'd do it with you. If there isn't the time, that's okay. I know that, that's okay. How's the time going? I've talked about 4 methodologies so far. Number 1, grammar translation. Number 2, audiolingual. Number 3, functional notional. Number 4, communicative. These all were present in my language learning and teaching career over the last 50 years. More changes will come, I'm sure, particularly as technologies as with Professor Jay's videos. In Australia, the most recent new method is what they call intercultural language learning. ICLL, based in the University of South Australia. It's based on a cultural comparison in which the language activities are related to the two cultures. If you're teaching English in Bali, you maybe take a theme like holidays or religions, then take the target culture and take your own culture and compare the two. It's a comparative cultural exercise. This is now dominant in schools around Australia. Not in universities, but in schools. Because state departments of education can enforce methodologies through curriculum. Number 5 is intercultural language learning. The starting point of grammar translation is grammar. The starting point of audiolingual is patterns. The starting point of functional notion is functions. The starting point of communicative is tasks, pair work, and the starting point of ICLL is cultural comparison. It's always the same language you're teaching, but it's the starting point, the philosophy, and the activities that you use in class that change. Now, in my paper, I talk about the problems that I see with a lot of texts in Australia for language learning, and Professor Jay has already mentioned the ones in Malaysia, and the ones in Australia are much the same, Professor. There is a narrow emotional range of middle-class niceness. There's an avoidance of anything meaningful in human life. And so I put that in my paper. I won't discuss it much more here to look at it, but to say that, as Professor Jay has done, try and bring students' meanings from their lives into the classroom. Use a lot of realia, real-life pieces of material. Once again, I repeat the message, move away from texts. Texts in the background, bring in tasks. Bring in realia, bring in creativity based on that realia. The next thing I wanted to talk about, culture, the place of culture. Since culture is in our theme, I wanted to mention the fact that all language teachers believe that culture and language are inseparable. But it's very hard on a practical basis to know how to bring in the culture when you're busy teaching aspects of the language. They say culture and language are inseparable, but they seem very separable when you're in a classroom and you're busy trying to teach language. If I talk about the 5 methodologies, grammar translation tended to put culture into little readings, baca and kecil, and then you got into the novels or the poetry and you got the culture from there. Audiolingual put culture into the situations that the dialogues were embedded in. Functional notional is neutral on culture, it's a way of communicative, it depends on what tasks you choose. In intercultural language learning, cultural comparison comes at the basis of, it is the basis of where your language activities start. What I'd like to say to you is that in my teaching, I like to try and find the culture in the language. Can I give you some examples of that? Sure. But my examples are in Indonesian, is that okay?